Thank you so much for that warm and kind introduction. A very good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to thank you for the great honor of speaking at the Cambridge Africa Day. I return to Cambridge with great and deep gratitude. This place is not simply a venue for me. It is part of my intellectual upbringing. I was a member of Downing College. I came here, like you have already heard, to study computational biology, that remarkable discipline which asks us to take biological complexity seriously enough to model it, to measure it, and sometimes to predict it. But I also stand here and return as a witness to what Cambridge Africa and the wider Cambridge and UK research ecosystem has already done. I am one of those very early African scholars whose journey was shaped by the Cambridge Africa Network, alongside colleagues such as Annette Nachimuli and Robert Toyonjele. If you look at the very first website for Cambridge Africa, that young man carrying a red bag that you see there is John Kitayimbwa, standing right beside you. And so, at that time, we were not merely visitors to Cambridge. We were being formed, mentored, and connected for leadership back home. And as I look around the room, I can see many of the young students that are being formed right now by the team at Cambridge. And so thank you so much. I would like to say a special thank you to Professor David Dunn. I think he's going to be here, but he's not yet here. Professor David Dunn was one of those very first people that worked very hard in ensuring that we received a good education. And so as I make this keynote this morning, it is not a complaint against Cambridge. It says, because Cambridge Africa has already shown that equitable African-centered partnership is possible, we need to be asking the next question. And the next question is how we scale that spirit for a young African continent. The title I have been given is simple: Africa's Research Priorities, a forward vision for a young continent. And my argument this morning is very simple. Africa's future will not simply be secured by youthfulness alone, although that's a great asset. It will be secured when Africa is able to build capacity, to be able to define its own questions, to produce its own evidence, to govern its own data, and turn knowledge into public good. But let us, I think, first begin with a basic but often avoided truth. When we think about research priorities, I want to argue this morning that research priorities are never neutral. Every research agenda, if you look at it, is a moral map. It tells us what a society fears, what it values, what it counts, what it can fund, and sometimes what it has quietly agreed to ignore. And that's why this theme for today, supporting African agendas, is so important. It does not merely invite us to say we should include African researchers, but it is asking us to do something deeper. It is telling us that we should seriously take the agenda, the research agenda seriously, the question, the need, and the intellectual urgency of African institutions seriously. Cambridge Africa's own principles of engagement point in this direction. They speak of beginning research agendas by engaging existing research in the global south, and of investing the time that is needed and the resources required for genuine collaboration. And that's exactly what Africa needs at this time. And so as I challenge partnerships today, I am not rejecting partnerships. I am defending the highest form of it. The question today is not whether Cambridge should work with Africa. It already does, and often it has done this very well. The question is whether the next generation of collaboration will go beyond participation to African leadership, beyond projects to institutions, beyond publications to public value, and beyond generosity, to shared authorship of the future of the African continent. And as we do this, I want to sharpen the issue through a current but a very uncomfortable example. Let me use the Ebola example. I want to state clearly that as a computational biologist who has worked on infectious diseases, I do not speak lightly about outbreaks. And I want to say that Ebola is serious. And so it deserves surveillance, it deserves science, it deserves contract tracing, laboratory capacity, community trust, and courageous public health leadership. But if we think about Ebola and how we have reacted to Ebola, it teaches us something that I'm going to call the politics of attention. To date, if you look at the news, the WHO has reported 19 confirmed cases of Ebola in Uganda. And this has included 2 deaths in the wider Bundubujo Ebola outbreak that has been linked to the DRC. But you have noted, if you have been following the news, that even small case numbers, such as those, can unsettle travel. They can unsettle borders, trade, conferences. If you go to Uganda, you go to DRC, the fabric of society is completely broken. But that reaction is very understandable. But it leaves us with a harder question that I would like us to engage with. Why do some African deaths become global emergencies, while others become ordinary statistics? Let me just use an example from Uganda. Uganda's maternal mortality rate remains very high. The WHO office recently placed the maternal mortality ratio at 189 deaths per 100,000 live births. And it places the neonatal mortality at 22 deaths per 1,000 live births. Friends, those are many people dying. These deaths, when they happen at home, they do not lead to closure of airports. They do not always trigger global panic. But if you are Ugandan like me, they wound African families every single day. And so when we are thinking about African research priorities, I am arguing this morning that this must not be shaped only by what frightens the world. They must also be shaped by what quietly wounds the African. And as we think about that, I was thinking and I was saying, but who gets to decide what Africa must know in order to be able to become what Africa has got to become? This is not an anti-Cambridge question, friends, and it is not anti-Western at all, but it is a mature partnership question. For too long, research about Africa has sometimes been driven by external panic, external curiosity, external funding cycles, or external theories. But if you think about African communities, they carry questions that are older, that are deeper, and sometimes less fashionable than the questions that appear in calls for proposals. As you think about the African back home, a mother dying during childbirth is asking a research question. A child who is completing school without literacy is asking us a research question. A farmer who is losing predictability when it comes to rains and rainy season is asking us a research question. A young graduate going out of our schools and universities without work is asking us a research question. A public institution that citizens do not trust is asking us a research question. A language absent from AI systems is asking us a research question. And so the first act of intellectual freedom is the right to name the question. And I think as we think about Africa and the research agenda, that right for Africa to ask the right question is important. And the finest partnerships do not take that right away, but they rather strengthen it. And I want to propose, as you think about Africa, I don't know how you think about Africa. Sometimes Africa is thought of as being very peripheral to things that have got to do with research. But I want to say this morning that Africa is not merely catching up. Africa is where many global futures are arriving early. The United Nations has noted that 70% of sub-Saharan Africa is under the age of 30 years. The Ugandan statistics are even more frightening. 74% of the Ugandan population is under the age of 24. And so, if you think about the Economic Commission for Africa, it is projecting that by 2050, every 1 out of 3 young people globally will be African. And Africa's working age population is predicted to rise dramatically. And as we think about this, these are not just demographic facts, but these are research imperatives. Africa is living through questions that the world will increasingly face. For example, we are now battling with the question of how to educate large young populations. How do you maintain institutional trust under pressure? How do we govern AI, for example, when data is unequal? In Africa, we are looking at how to build the cities faster than disorder builds itself around our cities. We are leaving out the crisis of climate stress. In Africa, we are battling with the issue of how to hold science, ethics, faith, and community together. And that's why I'm arguing this morning that Africa must stop accepting the role of being a case study. Africa is not merely where global theories must and can be tested. We need to move into the dispensation where Africa is where new theories must be born. And Cambridge at its best is exactly the kind of place that should understand this. Great universities like Cambridge exist not only to preserve knowledge, but to ask better questions before history forces them upon us. And when you think about this phrase, young continent, it can easily become a slogan. We must not allow it to become one. Youth is not destiny. Youth is pressure, and we're seeing this pressure on every system. The young population of Africa is testing schools, it is testing universities, it is testing health systems, labor markets, churches, families, courts, cities, public administrations, and so on and so forth. At Uganda Christian University, where I lead, I see this every day. Young people in Africa are not merely asking for certificates. They are now starting to ask whether the education we are giving them is preparing them for a world of AI, climate stress, economic uncertainty, and moral confusion. The demographic divide of the African population will not be harvested by simply counting young people. It will be harvested if we are going to form these young people well. And so the research questions that we set in this room are not merely, for example, how many young people does Africa have? The deeper question we should ask is, what kind of institutions must Africa build so that its young people become creators of public value rather than victims of a failed system? And I think this is very important, because if by 2050, 1 out of 3 of the young people of the labor force, the young labor force, will be African, it is in everyone's interest that we educate and train them. And so, as you think about Africa, one of the things that we have suffered from for a very long time is a conversion problem. I want to say that Africa does not lack intelligence. What we suffer from is a conversion failure. We have very brilliant young people. We have memory, we have cultural depth, we have faith, we have biodiversity, we are gifted by nature, we have data, we have lived experience, but often these are not converted into durable public value. Our experience as African people has not become research, and research that we have done has not become policy. Where we have policy, it has not led to systems, and systems have not given birth to justice. And justice, the way we know it in Africa, has not become trust. And the trust has not become national confidence. And so my own training in computational biology has taught me that complex systems fail, not because components are absent, but because the relationship between components are weak. Africa's problem is not the absence of talent, we have a lot of it. It is the weakness of the conversion pathway. And so as we think about African research priorities, these must be judged by whether they repair this painful chain. Intelligence to research, to policy, to systems, to trust, and to flourishing. And that's where African universities and the global academy become critical. We must be the conversion engines for the continent. I am laying the ground, and I'm saying, as you know about Africa and the history, we know about extraction. We have extracted minerals, land, labor, oil, gold, diamond. We know about that. But the 21st century is bringing even a subtler form of extraction. Because as we speak now, the extraction is about data. It's about genomic extraction. It's about cultural extraction. It's about talent extraction. It's about narrative extraction. It's about imagination extraction. And I'm not arguing for isolation here. African data should contribute to global knowledge. African scholars should work with Cambridge, should work with Oxford, should work with Harvard, Makerere, UCU, Cape Town, Nairobi, Lagos, Accra, and many others. The question is not whether knowledge should travel. It must. But the question that we have to face in this room today is that it should travel under what terms? For example, who frames the question? Who owns the data? Who leads the analysis? And so on and so forth. In the older economy, Africa exported raw materials, and sadly, it imported finished goods. Where I come from in Uganda, we are good growers of coffee, and we do export unprocessed coffee beans, and in return, we import back processed coffee at a very expensive price. This is what we are used to. But in the new African economy, friends, Africa must not export raw materials. It must not export raw data and import finished intelligence. That will be very dangerous. And this is where the Cambridge Africa model matters. For example, the Albarada Research Fund has greatly supported pairs of African and Cambridge researchers. And its aim to catalyze and strengthen collaborations is very commendable. And that's the right instinct. The next task for the people in this room is to make such a practice the norm across global research. I want to say, this was the extraction, sorry. I want to argue and say now that sorry. As I begin to talk about the research agenda, the temptation at this moment in time is to start thinking about sectors, to say we need health, we need agriculture, we need AI. But as I was thinking through this, I said, no, sectors alone do not lead to a compelling research agenda, because they can simply become some sort of development conference catalog. What I think we need to do is to begin with very important questions. And from these questions, we need to be able to come out with the right research agenda. These are some of the questions I want to go through. For example, how can we keep our people alive? How can we form young people? And so on and so forth. Let me do that on the next slide. The first question is brutally simple. And I think this will help us to define the right research agenda. What must Africa know to keep its people alive? And when we ask this question, we are talking about epidemic preparedness, It includes cases such as Ebola, Marburg, COVID-19, influenza. We are talking about antimicrobial resistance. We are talking about diagnostics. We are talking about vaccines, pathogen genomics, surveillance, and the like. But as we ask that question, it must also include the deaths that do not always frighten the world, and that's very important. For example, the maternal deaths, the new deaths, malaria, malnutrition, the non-communicable diseases, mental health, trauma, poor diagnostics, unsafe surgery, and unreliable health systems. To us as Africans, we are saying that every preventable death should ask a research question. A society becomes wise when its wounds become questions before they become statistics, and I think we need to take advantage of that. The second question that could lead to a good research agenda is what must Africa know in order to be able to feed, to power, and to house a young continent? And when we think about food, food is not simply agriculture. Food security is sovereignty. It is nutrition, it is climate resilience, it is trade, it is peace, dignity, and public health. When we think energy, we shouldn't only think about electricity, but we are thinking education, we are thinking industry, we are thinking the digital life, enterprise, hospital reliability, household dignity, and national productivity. When we think housing, I'm not thinking about only buildings. I am thinking urban planning. I'm thinking sanitation, transport, land governance, public health, safety, and belonging. A young continent cannot depend permanently on very fragile global supply chains, imported food systems, imported energy models, and cities that grow faster than public planning. And that's why when we think climate research for Africa, it must be, for example, practical and locally grounded. It must include things such as seed systems, soil health, water governance, indigenous crops and varieties, agro-processing, renewable energy, informal settlements, transport, and the design of cities that do not punish the poor. Cambridge can help here, not by arriving with already made answers, not by strengthening things of that sort, but by strengthening Africa-led research platforms. For example, where farmers, engineers, environmental scientists, urban planners, economists, and communities can co-produce knowledge. A continent like Africa that cannot feed, power, and house its people cannot fully determine its future. The third question that would be of interest to us is how can we form our young people, that young population? And I use that word form intentionally. I'm not saying how can we educate. You know, education, if you think about it, it's not merely the delivery of content, something we have done in Africa for a long time, but it is how do we shape competence? How do we shape judgment? How do we shape imagination, character, and responsibility? At UCU, where I work daily, I have become convinced that higher education in Africa must move beyond credentialing. Degrees matter, first degrees matter, yes, but degrees alone will not transform the African continent. Universities must now produce graduates who can think, who can create, who can research, who can build, who can serve and lead. And that's why we are now talking competency-based education. We are now talking AI readiness. We are talking about research-infused teaching, postgraduate development, and a whole person formation. These friends are important and are critical to our transformation of our education system. Fortunately, since the 2020, the world has not been very kind to us as Africans. We have gotten a number of disruptions. I don't know whether you know the kind of disruptions we have had. We had COVID-19. We have had integrative AI. We have had, I have an interesting disruption that I call Trump. In the last, in the last 1.5 years, Trump has completely disrupted this world. And I think all those disruptions are calling for fundamental change, especially in the way that we form our people. Cambridge, the University of Cambridge, helped many of us, not merely by giving us information, but by immersing us in a culture of asking questions. And that is one of the great gifts of this university. The question now is how African universities can build similar cultures of serious inquiry adapted to African realities, resourced by African commitments, and strengthened by global friendships. Africa must not educate for yesterday's economy, yesterday's institutions, and yesterday's imaginations. By the way, Africa as a continent has now a chance to actually build one of the best universities. I am persuaded, and I think that with all the disruptions going around in higher education, we can have one of the top 5 universities in the world coming from the African continent, if we are bold enough to take the right reforms that are needed to do that. One of the other questions we need to ask is, what must Africa know to be able to govern technology before technology governs Africa? You know, we are talking about AI, we are talking about generative AI. Friends, if you like it or not, it is reshaping education. It is reshaping work the way we know it. But if Africa only consumes AI systems built from elsewhere, using using other languages which are not African, what is going to happen is that African languages, the histories, the values, the vulnerabilities, and the possibilities will be very underrepresented in those systems. This is not simply a digital divide. What we are wrestling with now is an epistemic divide. It is about whose data trains the model, whose language is visible, whose culture is misread, whose pain is misclassified, whose school system is disrupted, whose elections are manipulated, and whose young people are formed by invisible architectures of attention. Africa must research African language technologies, data governance, cybersecurity, digital public infrastructure, algorithmic fairness, AI in education, and the like. Here again, Cambridge can help, not by owning the African AI agenda, but by supporting African data trusts, African language resources, African doctoral training like we're already doing, and African-led ethics frameworks. If Africa does not shape AI, AI is already and will surely shape Africa according to someone else's assumptions. And this we need to work hard on. The 5th question is, and this is a big problem to us, what must Africa know in order to build institutions people can trust? You know, we have had disruptions, but every disruption has become an institutional test. Epidemics have tested our health systems. Climate change is testing our planning. AI is testing regulation and ethics. Youth unemployment is testing education and labor markets. Debt is testing public finance. Conflicts are testing legitimacy and so on. Corruption is testing our moral authority. And this means that when we talk about Africa's research agenda, this must necessarily include law, governance, public finance, institutional design, anti-corruption systems, decentralization, land justice, peace-building courts, policy implementation, and public administration. But we must go deeper than institutional diagrams. We must ask our questions, and the Africans in the room here can attest, why citizens are still mistrusting systems. We must ask ourselves the question as to why policies fail between announcement and implementation. Why public services sometimes humiliate the people they exist to serve. And why corruption in Africa survives not only as an illegality, but as a social practice. Why we have the law, but without justice. Friends, the quality of Africa's future will be limited by the quality of the institutions on the African continent. The second last question that we have to ask is, what must Africa know to remain human even under such a great disruption? A continent like Africa will not be built by technology and science alone. It will be built by also moral imagination. And this is not, friends, a very decorative humanitarian section. I am saying research priorities, even in this room, must include theology, they must include ethics, culture, identity, family, gender justice, death, grief, memory, reconciliation, religion, and public life. AI, for example, is raising ethical questions. Climate change is raising stewardship questions. Public health is raising trust questions. Youth unemployment is raising so many things. And that's why it is important that we consider this. We ought to remain human. Let me just give you a quick example. There was a community somewhere in Africa where a campaign for immunization was done for both animals and for the human beings in the same community. The turn-up for the animals was about 95%. People were willing to get their animals immunized. But the turn-up for people was at 10%. And the people tried to get people to get immunized, but they were not coming. These people knew the importance of immunization, but not for themselves. And what happened is that after they have spent a lot of money on the science, they sent a social scientist down there to find out why. And when the social scientists talked to the community, the answer was very simple. The people said, these guys who come to immunize, they believe that they're the ones which are not God. They cannot even say Bismillah. They don't pray before they do it. And so the answer was that you retrain the people so that before they immunize, they say Bismillah. And when they did that in 2 months, they turn up. And so this is very important, that we remain human amidst the disruption. And finally, the last question. I think I've noted it, but the last question that we needed to talk about is what must Africa do? I think I have said all this, but let me say them very quickly. 1, Africa must name its own questions. Number 2, Africa must build institutions with patience. We cannot improvise research excellence during emergencies if we neglected institutions during peace. So we need laboratories, doctoral schools, ethics bodies, and we have to build these patiently. Thirdly, Africa must convert wounds into knowledge. Every preventable death must lead to a research question. Every failed harvest must lead to a research question. Every broken classroom, every delayed medicine, every corrupt transaction, every unemployed graduate must lead us to a research question. Number 4, Africa must govern data with dignity. Number 5, we must redesign our education. Because I'm coming from a university, I'm saying we must redefine universities. And number 6, Africa must translate research into public value. I want to commend the UK government, because the UK government is one of those governments that is using research to lead its policies and all. And if you have looked at how, for example, the UK government has responded to the Ebola pandemic, it has not responded through misinformation, it has not responded through all these other things. It is looking at the underlying data, and it is using the data to inform its actions. And number 7, which Cambridge is helping us to do very well, is that we need to form scholar leaders. And this is where Cambridge is doing well, and we want to commend you. The UNESCO Institute for Statistics recently reported global research and development expenditure at about 1.92% of GDP. But when you look at the section for sub-Saharan Africa, it stands at about 0.38% of GDP. And if you come to Uganda, that is at 0.03%. Friends, that gap is not only financial, but it is a future gap. Africa must be invited to fund what it says matters, because if it does not fund it, I think we are finished. What would be Cambridge's role in this? I wanted to look at this quickly. Cambridge Africa has already done something tremendous. It has supported researchers promoted equitable partnerships, it has built networks, it has funded collaborations, it has mentored scholars, and it has helped many return home as leaders. And I am part of that story. And that's what I think agent strengthening looks like. It does not replace African scholars, but it helps to form them. The Alborada Research Fund has carried the spirit forward. Established in 2012 with support from the Alborada Trust and later expanded with further support, it has made hundreds of awards that are connecting Cambridge and African researchers across many countries and disciplines. I want to say that the UK government also deserves recognition through mechanisms such as the DFID-linked and the ODA-funded research, the GCRF and the Wellcome Trust DFID Delta's Africa Initiative, and so many other initiatives. The UK government has helped finance African research leadership. And so my challenge is not that Cambridge must start caring. My challenge to Cambridge today is that take what you have done well and help us scale it for the next disrupted century on the African continent. The future, friends, must be researched. It will not simply arrive because we're a young continent. I've already argued that a young continent, if you think about it, it can be exploited, it can be distracted, it can be full of unemployed people, it can be manipulated, it can be narrated by others. But as a young continent, we also have some advantages. We can learn, we can build, we can heal, we can invent, we can govern, we can do all sorts of things. And so the question is whether Africa will be able to build research systems worth of its children. The question is whether we are going to be able to convert our wounds into questions, into knowledge, into institutions, and into flourishing. And the question for Cambridge Africa this morning is whether this partnership can help ensure that Africa is not merely being studied as the continent of the future, but strengthened to become one of the authors for the future. Cambridge Africa, like I've said, has shown that this is possible. It has helped us. It has supported us. It has demonstrated that partnership can be done with dignity. Now, we must enlarge that horizon. The future, as Africans, must be researched before it is inherited. And for a young continent and for generations to come, we owe it to them to do it. And so I want to say thank you, Cambridge Africa. And if you are an African, you can see some of these words. Asante is Swahili for thank you. Webale Nyo is from Uganda. Medase, Nagode, and so on and so forth. Thank you to Cambridge Africa for building bridges when they were not fashionable. I want to mention some people. Thank you, Cambridge mentors, and the mentors are with us in the room, for investing in African scholars before they have become professors, deans, and so on and so forth. I want to say thank you to the funders in the room, including the UK-based philanthropies, the Wellcome Trust, the UK government, Alborada Trust, who recognize that African research leadership is not charity, but it is global wisdom. And I want to thank the African scholars, the students, the administrators, communities, patients, farmers, teachers, policymakers, whose lives carry the questions we must never abandon. As a person, I came to Cambridge years ago to learn computational biology. I have returned today now convinced of something even deeper. Living systems are complex, but so are societies, institutions, partnerships, and futures. I pray that from this room we shall have the humility to study them, the courage to transform them, and the wisdom to ensure that Africa's young people inherit not merely a continent of potential, but a continent of knowledge, dignity, justice, and hope. Thank you so much.
John, please join me on stage. I think I'm sure you can hear me in the room, but do we need a microphone for the audience? We've got mics. Okay. Thank you. And John, that was just a really powerful and really meaningful call to action. I think it resonates very deeply with what we're trying to do here, and I know that colleagues in the room will reinforce that. But I think it's so wonderful to see you articulate it so clearly and so with such depth of knowledge and feeling. So I do want to invite our colleagues in the audience to ask a couple of questions. I think we've got a hand up there. Tabitha.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. And it's very nice to see all the discussion about the setting research agenda in Africa. My question is how to get young people to set research questions, because the young people are very wounded, these teenagers, 20-year-olds. It's the middle-aged who are still, even if we say Africa set priorities, it's the middle-aged who are setting these priorities. The over 30s. So I just want to ask, how can we, not tokenistically, but realistically engage young people to set research questions? For example, in Kenya, young people, teenagers are banning schools. The older people are saying it's the devil. How do we get the young people to tell us where the issues are, real, genuinely engage young people?
Should we take another couple of questions and I'll invite John to this one? I see a hand at the back there and then one front there.
Thank you so much, Professor John. Really thought-provoking speech you've given there. All of what you've mentioned are very interesting and key, but I just wanted to find out how, in your opinion, you think the continent itself can begin to raise the funds to be able to fund all of those research priorities that you've spoken about. Because oftentimes, we talked about the Trump disruption, which was quite great. It was very, very disruptive, HIV treatment and all of that. But when can we begin to look inwards to see what we can do for ourselves as well? Thank you.
Thank you. I've got two hands in the front here. We take two questions. They're both in this row. And then I'm going to invite John to respond.
Thank you, Prof, for your talk. And I like the fact that you referred to maternal health. I'm an obstetrician, and so it was so inspiring for me. You also talked about the disruptions, and my question comes from that. Based on the fact that a lot of research funding is external and the priorities are basically donor funded, what can the institutions do? And from the institution that you lead, what are some of the practical steps that you've taken so that you do not risk stopping the research based on the disruptions that come with external funding? What are some of the things, practical steps that you can share with us from African institutions that they can adopt such that external funding, if it is stopped, does not disrupt that pathway? Thank you.
Thank you. Final question just here.
Hi, my name is Shobhana Bhattacharya. We have one of the largest STEM charity in this country. And we got lots of invitation and asked to come to Africa and to transfer the knowledge, what you said on the slide, that future gap, what we are training here in the youth and children in Cambridge, the similar technique we should take to the Africa. So I have already booked my tickets for the 10 days. I'm going to Lagos for 10 days with my all this technical support what we are training here. My question is that I want to run a survey that what exactly the youth and children they're looking for the new AI generated technology and education that will help them more and shape them in a better structure for the future path. So I'm here to help. We have already booked our tickets with lots of equipment that we are taking there.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. So, John, actually, they cluster nicely. We've got the first and last question asking about youth and young people, and both how do we find out what they're looking for in the future? How do we help them to articulate the questions that most animate their lives? And then we've got two questions which are really about funding, the disruptions that occur because of donors changing their minds, choosing to withdraw funding. How do you actually build resilience in the face of that uncertainty?
Thank you so much for those questions. I think in terms of involving the children, our biggest problem has been and is the education system. Because the education system that we have run for a long time is one where we have really used the professors, the teachers, to simply transfer knowledge to the young people. We speak down to the young ones. We tell them what is right. We want to teach them how to think. We want, in fact, sometimes I wonder, when we think about plagiarism, you know, when you come to the university, you are taught about plagiarism. But in the African classroom, you are told to plagiarize from year one up to when you are entering the university. And suddenly, you are told that what you have been doing for so many years is wrong academically. And what these disruptions have done, I think is we should not miss the opportunity that the disruptions have brought. And if we miss, my prediction is that the old university, for example, that we know it, is not going to exist in the next 5 years. It is going to be gone. It is going to be finished. And what we need to do, for those who are in education here, one thing that has governed education is what they call the Bloom's taxonomy. And when you think Bloom's taxonomy, there are some low-end things we have been emphasizing, like recall, memorization, and all those things. AI is doing that perfectly well. Now we need to flip the classroom. We need to have more learner-centered rather than teacher-centered settings. We need to, in fact, one of the things, I think even Cambridge here you affected, how are you, for example, touching assessments? I have heard in some departments that people are now calling back students to do written what? Exams. When you are doing that, you are like an ostrich covering your head in the sand, and you're hoping that this wave is going to pass away. But what it is inviting us to do is to reinvent, to reimagine, to rethink. And finally, when you think about the funding will continue to fund what it thinks is important. And until Africa is ready to fund what it thinks is important, nothing is going to change. And so what we are doing, like at the Uganda Christian University, we have now dedicated 3% of our annual budget to fund local questions, and I think that's very important. We can have a discussion on what you are saying, but my time is up. Thank you so much.
John, thank you. Thank you both for being so efficient with your responses. I know there's a lot of depth behind what you've just said, but we do have a break coming up in about 15 minutes. So please do find time. We've got half an hour for coffee, and do find time to engage with John. John, I want to thank you deeply for coming back to share your wisdom with us. I think it's been wonderful to hear you. I think you've set for us challenges and agendas that I hope we can all respond to, and we look forward to working together with you. And thank you for setting off today in such a fine way.